There is a place in the Dragon Ball universe that most people never got to visit, a world set 216 years beyond the final page of the manga, where the children of Goku's era had grown old and the world they left behind had slowly, quietly changed. It exists now only in memory, in old screenshots, in forum threads from people who were there. If this kind of calm, forgotten history is the sort of thing that helps you rest, subscribe for more quiet Dragon Ball stories, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. And as we settle into what Dragon Ball Online really was, a game unlike anything the franchise had attempted before or since, an experiment in world building that stretched canon into territory most fans never explored. This is the story of the best forgotten Dragon Ball game, told slowly for a quiet night. Part 1. The world that Akira Toriyama built for a game. There was a version of the Dragon Ball universe that most Western fans never got to see. It was not a movie. It was not a manga chapter. It was a video game, a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, and it was designed under the direct supervision of Akira Toriyama himself, the creator of the entire Dragon Ball series. The game was called Dragon Ball Online, and in the years it existed, it told a story set further into the Dragon Ball future than anything that had come before it. The setting was age 1000, 216 years after Goku had walked away from the 28th World Martial Arts Tournament with a young boy named Oob at his side, 216 years after the Buu saga had drawn to a close. The world had moved on in the time since, and it had moved on in ways that were strange and specific and deeply considered. Toriyama did not simply lend his name to the project. He was involved in a genuine, hands-on way that went beyond approval meetings and promotional appearances. He personally designed the major new characters introduced in the game. He contributed to the direction of the story. He shaped the look of a world that had been left to evolve on its own for more than 2 centuries. This was not a common thing. Most Dragon Ball games of the era, the Budokai games, the Tenkaichi games, were built around existing characters and existing stories. They let players replay battles they already knew the outcome of. Dragon Ball Online asked something different. It asked, what happened next? And the answer it gave was expansive. It was detailed. It was in many ways the most ambitious piece of Dragon Ball world building ever committed to an interactive format. The game was developed simultaneously in Japan and South Korea by a studio called NTL. It ran on a game engine called Renderware. It was first released in Korea in February of 2010, then in Taiwan in June of 2011, and then in Hong Kong in September of that same year. It never came to the West. It never received an official English release. It never arrived in Japan in any form that fans could play. For most of the people who would have been interested in it, Dragon Ball Online existed only as rumors, as translated forum posts, as grainy video footage of someone else playing through a story they could not read. That distance, the gap between knowing the game existed and actually being able to experience it, became one of the defining things about Dragon Ball Online. It was a game that felt, to Western fans especially, like something glimpsed through a window from very far away. And then, in 2013, it closed entirely. The Korean servers went offline on the 26th of September. The Taiwanese and Hong Kong servers followed on the 31st of October. Dragon Ball Online was gone, but the story it had told and the world it had built did not disappear entirely. Its echoes continued, its ideas resurfaced. And for the people who had been there, who had played through its quests and wandered its landscapes and absorbed its vision of where the Dragon Ball universe might go, the memory of it remains something worth returning to. This is that story, told slowly in the quiet of the night. Tlo, Part 2, The Years Between Goku and the Year 1000. To understand Dragon Ball Online's world, you have to understand the 216 years that separated it from the end of Dragon Ball Z. Those years were not empty. They were filled with events, some small and personal, some large and world-shaping. and the game's designers documented all of them with a care that felt more like history than fiction. It began 3 years after the 28th World Martial Arts Tournament, in what the Dragon Ball timeline calls Age 787. The 29th Tenkaichi Budokai was held. Mr. Satan, as he so often had, claimed the championship. Majin Buu, his oldest and most unusual friend, finished as the runner-up. Around the same time, a conversation was happening on a different level entirely. Dende, who served as Earth's guardian, had been told something by the other Kai, the divine beings who oversaw the balance of the universe. They warned him that the Dragon Balls had begun to distort the natural order. The world was at peace. The great threats had been defeated. And in times of peace, the Dragon Balls could become a temptation, a way for ordinary people to reach for things beyond what should be possible. Dende began to consider sealing them away. In age 790, the 30th Tenkaichi Budokai came and went. Mr. Satan and Buu were once again the champion and the runner-up. Things seemed stable. Ordinary even, in the way that the Dragon Ball world could occasionally feel ordinary between its great upheavals. But something was changing in Majin Buu. Quietly, privately, he was becoming aware of something he did not have. He had Mr. Satan. He had a home. He had a life that was full of things he enjoyed. But he did not have a partner. He did not have someone who belonged to him in the way that Mr. Satan had his family, his fame, his history. One day, in Mr. Satan's study, Buu found a book. It was a piece of erotic fiction, the same book, as it happened, that Master Roshi had once used to teach a young Goku how to read. The book was called Bob and Margaret's Forbidden Games. Buu read it, and through it, he came to understand something about love and partnership that he had not understood before. What happened next was uniquely, impossibly Buu. He created a partner for himself. Using his own particular abilities, he shaped a female Majin out of himself, a counterpart, a companion, a being he could share his life with. She became known as Ms. Buu. In age 791, Miss Buu and Buu had a child together. They used a technique called the love beam to do it. The child was named Baby Buu, though he later came to be called Bobby. He was the first member of a new race, the Mayin race as it would exist going forward, a people descended from the original Mayin Buu who would grow and multiply over the centuries that followed. These are the kinds of details Dragon Ball Online gave to its world. Small, strange, specific details that added texture to the gap between the end of the manga and the game's present day. They were not dramatic revelations. They were not earth-shattering twists. They were just the quiet accumulation of time, the way that even the most extraordinary beings eventually settle into something that resembles an ordinary life. Before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. To Part 3, M.R. Satan, the Legend, and the Retirement. In age 793, something changed in the public life of the world's most famous martial artist. Mr. Satan announced his retirement. He gave the world a gracious, public reason for stepping away. He said it was time for a new generation to have its chance. He spoke about legacy, about the natural cycle of champions, about the importance of giving the young their moment. The crowds who had loved him for so many years received this explanation with warmth and admiration. The real reason was simpler. Buu had grown bored with the Tenkaichi Budokai. Without Buu, there was nothing to rig. Without the ability to quietly arrange the outcomes in his favor, Mr. Satan had no way to guarantee his continued championship. And so retirement, which he framed as generosity, was in fact a sensible exit from a situation that had quietly become impossible for him. He did not rest for long, though. Mr. Satan was not built for quietude. He found a new project almost immediately, a correspondence course in martial arts that bore his name and his image. He sold videos, produced demonstrations using special effects that made his ordinary abilities look supernatural, and charged prices that were, by any reasonable standard, quite high for what they offered. In age 794, his granddaughter Pan took over. Pan was 15 years old at the time, when the buyers of Satan's correspondence course, unsatisfied with their progress, furious at having spent money on something that had not made them stronger, descended on the Satan household, demanding refunds. It was Pan who met them at the door. She was 15, and she was a descendant of Goku, and she handled the situation in the way that a descendant of Goku would handle it. She beat them, calmly, efficiently, and without apparent concern for the disparity in numbers. The footage of a 15-year-old girl dispersing an angry crowd of adult martial arts students made news. It brought attention not just to Pan, but to what she was doing, which was something meaningfully different from what her grandfather had been selling. Pan renamed the operation the Pan Fighting Network and began teaching in earnest. The people who came to her learned things that actually worked. In age 796, another piece of the Mr. Satan legacy arrived. A film was released called The Legend of Satan. It was an action movie. It starred Mr. Satan, and it used special effects to portray him performing techniques that would not have been out of place in a fight involving the actual Z Warriors, energy blasts, impossible speed, feats of strength that defied anything an ordinary human being could manage. The film did not perform particularly well at the box office. By conventional measures, it was not a success. But it found an audience. It developed a following, and in finding that following, it did something unexpected. It made people curious about whether the things it depicted were possible. It made them want to understand the energy techniques they had seen on screen, to know if something like key control was real, and if so, how one might learn it. This curiosity would eventually feed into something much larger, but at the time it was simply a somewhat unsuccessful movie about a beloved public figure quietly gathering its small and devoted audience. Pooh Law Part 4, The Disappearance. In age 800, planet Yardrat was destroyed. The Yardratians were the people who had taught Goku the instant transmission technique during his journey home from Namek, a species remarkable for their mastery of advanced movement and spatial techniques. Their planet's destruction was noted in the Dragon Ball Online timeline without elaboration. What caused it? Who was responsible? What became of the Yardratians themselves? These were questions the timeline raised and then left to settle in silence. In age 801, Son Goku vanished from the Earth. He and Vegeta were both in their 70s by this point. The Saiyan body, which ages slowly through the middle years of life and then accelerates rapidly toward the end, had begun to change in both of them. Their peak physical capabilities were declining. They were no longer what they had been in their prime, and both of them knew it. They made a decision together. They left Earth. They departed to somewhere beyond the reach of telescopes and communication devices. Somewhere they could spend what remained of their extraordinary lives doing what they had always wanted to do, fighting each other, freely and fully, without concern for what was below them or what might be damaged in the process. Years later, Earth's astronomers began to detect supernovas in a distant region of space, massive stellar explosions, the kind of energy release associated with the death of stars. Some people who were paying attention believed they understood what those explosions were. They believed they were the residual traces of a battle between two beings whose power, even in their old age, was something the universe could feel. It is a quiet kind of ending for the two greatest warriors the Saiyan race had ever produced. Not a death in battle. Not a final heroic sacrifice. Just two old men going somewhere private to settle something between themselves at a scale that left marks on the sky. In age 804, Gohan did something different. He sat down and wrote a book. After his father's departure, Gohan turned inward. He began to think about everything he had experienced, every fight he had survived, every transformation he had managed, every technique he had learned to use. He began to wonder whether what he and his friends had done could be explained in terms that ordinary people might understand, whether Ki, the energy that underpinned everything the Z Warriors had accomplished, was something anyone could learn to channel, or whether it was restricted to a handful of extraordinary individuals. The book he produced was called Groundbreaking Science. It examined Ki control as a real and learnable discipline. It argued that what had appeared to be magic or superhuman ability was in fact something more accessible, something that could be studied, practiced, and gradually developed by anyone willing to commit to the work. The book became, in the quiet martial arts community of the early 9th century, something of a foundational text. Its reach was modest at first, but its influence was slow and accumulating. Part 5. The Schools. In age 805, Gohan's book had already begun to change things. Goten and Trunks, both of whom had grown up alongside the events of the Buu saga and had spent their lives training in the shadow of their father's achievements, read the book and saw something in it that they could build upon. They had been thinking about the question Gohan had raised: what can people who know Ki do that ordinary martial arts alone cannot achieve? And they had arrived at a specific answer. What if Ki could be applied to the art of swordsmanship? What if the channeling of energy properly developed could transform the sword from a simple physical weapon into something capable of cutting through far more formidable things? They began to develop this idea seriously. They called the style Kikoken Jutsu, Ki control swordsmanship. They built a school around it. The school had a simple underlying philosophy that Ki manipulation and blade technique, combined with sufficient dedication, could allow an earthling practitioner to participate meaningfully in battles against opponents who were physically superior to them. The gap between an ordinary person and a Saiyan was vast, but a person who had mastered this discipline could find ways to make themselves useful in that kind of fight. The school would eventually grow into one of the defining martial arts traditions of Dragon Ball Online's era. In the year H820, when the remnants of Frieza's army arrived on Earth expecting to find an undefended world, it was Goten and Trunks' swordsmanship discipline that would help turn them back. But that story belongs to a slightly later time. In age 820, Mr. Satan died. He had lived a long life, a life full of tournament wins that were not entirely earned, of friendships with beings who defied the limits of ordinary human experience, of films and correspondence courses, and a granddaughter who had surpassed everything he had ever pretended to be. The King of Earth honored him with a national funeral. Around the same time, the remnants of Frieza's forces arrived. These were soldiers who had survived the collapse of the Frieza Empire. Soldiers who had not been present during the battles on Namek, who had not seen Goku, who had not seen the Super Saiyans, who had not witnessed any of the things that had ended their leader's reign. They had gathered what remained of themselves in the years since, and they had come to Earth with the intention of avenging Frieza and King Cold. They had made a serious miscalculation, believing that the man responsible for their leader's death was Mr. Satan, the public figure whose fame had ironically given him credit for things he never actually did. They chose the moment of his passing as the best time to strike. Earth's defenses, they assumed, had just been weakened by the loss of its greatest champion. West City was in danger. Bulma's city, Capsule Corporation's home, the place where Trunks had grown up. Buu intervened. He found a way to store the entire city within capsules, to physically compress it and protect it from the destruction that was coming. The Majin, who had by this time settled into their own community on Earth, gathered together to defend the place they now called home. And when the fighting came, Goten and Trunks were there, and they used the Kikukenjutsu they had been developing for 15 years to face Frieza's remnant forces directly. They prevailed, and in prevailing, they established something. The swordsman class, one of the 3 major martial arts traditions that would define Earth's fighters for the next 2 centuries, was born not as an abstraction or a curriculum, but as a thing tested in actual combat and found to work. Ton 6. The new Turtle School and the new Crane School. In age 821, The aftermath of the battle with Frieza's remnants had changed something in the public understanding of what martial arts could be. The fight had been witnessed, the techniques had been seen, and people wanted to learn. Master Roshi received a request to teach again. He declined. He was old in a way that even a turtle hermit could not ignore, and he recognized that what the next generation needed was not his particular style, but something that asked new questions. He asked two people to take his place, Krillin and Tien Shin Han. Krillin built the new turtle school. He set it up in the area near where Goku had first been active, a reference to the earliest days of the Dragon Ball story, when a young boy with a tail had wandered the countryside and found his first fights. The school Krillin built did not ask its students to become Saiyans. It did not promise them power levels they could not attain. It started from a different premise entirely. Krillin had spent most of his fighting career being outclassed. He knew better than almost anyone what it was like to stand in a battle where the opponents were categorically stronger than you and find ways to contribute anyway. He had developed strategies for it, ways of weakening enemies, ways of supporting allies, ways of making himself useful in fights that should by rights have been beyond him. His school was built around those strategies. He argued to his students that there was nothing shameful about this, that the fighter who understood their role in a larger battle, who could see where they were needed and position themselves accordingly, was as valuable as the fighter with the most raw power. He framed support as a discipline, not a consolation. He made it into something worth choosing deliberately rather than accepting reluctantly. And perhaps, buried somewhere beneath this philosophy, there was still something that felt like rivalry. Perhaps Krillin, who had grown up alongside Goku and had spent his entire life measuring himself against a standard he could never quite reach, still carried something unresolved about that relationship. The school he built was shaped by everything he had worked out in the long years since. Tien Shin Han went a different direction. He had also spent his career facing opponents who outpowered him, but what he had taken from that experience was different. He believed that the key was not support but technique, that a perfectly executed ki attack, applied at precisely the right moment, could affect even an opponent of overwhelming strength. He remembered the Shin Kikoho he had used against Cell. He remembered contributing to Goku's Genki-Dama against Kid Buu. He built his school, the New Crane School, around that principle. The two schools asked complementary questions. One asked how a fighter could make themselves useful to their allies. The other asked how a fighter could make their own strikes count against an enemy they could not match directly. Together they gave the next generation of Earth's martial artists two distinct paths to follow. Ta Part 7, The Slow Centuries. The Dragon Ball online timeline moves through the 9th century in a way that feels like watching seasons change from a very great distance. Events happen. The world adjusts to them. People live and work and train within the shape those events have made. In age 826, Yajirobe, who had spent so many years living on Korin's tower, far above the concerns of the world below, descended at last. He brought with him something practical and grounding, a plan to cultivate senzu beans on a larger scale, bringing them down from the isolated cultivation of Korin's tower and spreading them into the wider world. Senzu beans, the miraculous healing food that had saved so many fighters from injuries that should have been permanent, had always been scarce. Their cultivation was limited. The supply could not meet demand in any moment of large-scale conflict. Yajirobe's effort to change this was not glamorous. It was not the kind of thing that appears in tournament brackets or power-level discussions, but it was the kind of thing that mattered deeply to the world he lived in. In age 834, Frieza's remnant forces returned. 13 years after their first attempt, they came back to Earth, and this time they had grown stronger. The schools that had been established in the wake of the first attack, the Kikokanjutsu School, the New Turtle School, the New Crane School, all of them joined together to face this second assault. The battle was harder than the first. One Majin warrior named Man-Man fought to protect the people around them and died doing it. the loss of Man-Man registered across the entire Majin community as something profound, a wound that ran deeper than any ordinary defeat. Majin Buu himself felt it as a grief second only to the kind that had historically transformed him into something dangerous. And yet the Earth held. The combined schools, the Majin community, the people who had spent the years since the first attack preparing themselves for exactly this kind of fight, they were enough. In the years between age 850 and 852, a different kind of event was taking place. One that connected the Dragon Ball Online timeline to other stories being told in the larger Dragon Ball universe. The Dragon Balls, which Dende had considered sealing away in the early 8th century, had been reactivated. The events of the Xenoverse series, which Dragon Ball Online's own creators had helped to shape, were taking place within this window. Two different stories, running in parallel, separated by 150 years of their fictional timelines. Pull Part 8. The Namekians come home to Earth. In age 850, something terrible happened on the other side of the galaxy. New planet Namek, the world the Namekian people had rebuilt for themselves after the original Namek's destruction at Frieza's hands, was attacked and destroyed by Mira, the primary antagonist of Dragon Ball Online. Mira was a figure unlike anything Dragon Ball had introduced before. He was a being constructed from parts of multiple races, an artificial creation of sorts, designed for power originating from a place called the Demon Realm. He was accompanied by a figure named Towa, who was his partner and in many ways his architect. Together, they were building something. They were gathering strength, gathering resources, gathering DNA from the most powerful warriors in history. Their ultimate goal was conquest, but their methods were patient and indirect in ways that made them different from the franchise's earlier villains. When Mira attacked new planet Namek, the Namekians were not without resources. The great Elder Muri, the spiritual leader of the Namekian people, successor to the original guru, organized a response. Using a Genki Dama, the Namekians were able to protect several hundred of their people and enable their escape. Muri and these survivors made the journey to Earth. It was not an easy arrival. The Namekians who came to Earth were refugees, a people who had lost their world for the second time, who had been displaced from the home they had worked so hard to rebuild after the first destruction. They settled initially in West City, where the Majin community had already established a presence. Eventually, most of them moved to a region called Popo Stones in Yahoi Heights, a name that referenced the black magical stones that marked spiritual sites throughout the Dragon Ball world. What happened to that region over time was remarkable. The Namekians, applying the same environmental sensitivity that had characterized Namek itself, began to terraform the land around their settlement. They shaped it, gradually and deliberately, into something that resembled the world they had lost. The rocky outcroppings, the green atmosphere, the distinctive features of Namekian landscape, all of it was reproduced in miniature on a patch of earth that had never been anything like that before. They warned the Earth's king about Mira's army. The king kept this information quiet, fearing the panic it might cause among the general population. The threat was real, but it was not immediate, and there was not yet a clear way to address it. In age 853, the Namekians, now settled on Earth and without their homeland, began training. They were not going to be caught unprepared again. The classes that would eventually become the four major Namekian character types in Dragon Ball Online, the Demon Realm Warriors, the Magic Warriors, the Dende Priests, and the Poco Priests, had their origins in this period of deliberate preparation. And there was another complication to manage. Piccolo, who was by this time the world's most prominent Namekian warrior, became aware that some of the children he had spawned during an earlier, darker period of his existence had survived. They had been raised in a secret laboratory inside Pilaf's castle, the castle of the three-person gang who had spent decades in futile pursuit of world domination, and had since multiplied and spread into the wild in ways that Piccolo had not anticipated. Piccolo could not resolve this alone. At the suggestion of Great Elder Muri, he partnered with other Namekians to study these creatures, to understand them, and to develop ways of interacting with them. This collaboration became the foundation of the Poco Priest class, the Namekian specialists who could summon and command Pocopen, the small dragon-like creatures that were eventually derived from this research. P9. The Egg of Evil and the Dark Century. There is a phrase in Dragon Ball Online's history that carries a particular weight. The Egg of Evil. It was born, the timeline says, from the accumulated darkness in the hearts of the Majins who had come to Earth. The Majin race, descended from the original Majin Buu, carried within them an inheritance that was not simply physical. They carried the residue of what Buu had been before he was pacified, before he found Mr. Satan, before he learned to be gentle, before Miss Buu and their family softened him into something the world could live alongside. That darkness was not gone. It had been suppressed, redirected, channeled into the ordinary messiness of living, but it had not disappeared. In age 940 it manifested. Something was born from that collective inherited darkness, an egg sealed away beneath powerful wards, placed in a location where it could not grow or spread. But it existed. It was real, and like anything sealed in darkness, it was waiting. In age 972, the seal broke. From the egg of evil emerged a being named Namara, a black Namekian, shaped by the accumulated evil that had been locked away for more than 30 years. He found allies. He built a following among Namekians who were drawn to his power or convinced by his rhetoric. Civil war erupted within the Namekian community on Earth, a conflict between those who had come to their new home in good faith and those who had been turned towards something darker. The Dragon Ball Online timeline does not dwell on the Civil War in the way it dwells on earlier events. It notes it, records it, and moves forward. But its presence in the timeline is important. It establishes that even in the far future of the Dragon Ball universe, even 2 centuries after the great battles of the Z era, history does not simply stop. Conflict does not end. The same forces that had driven every earlier crisis, power, darkness, the temptation to take rather than build, continued to move through the world, finding new expressions. In age 990, the consequences of ongoing conflict were being felt across Earth. Evil organizations were forming in the spaces left by the Civil War and by Mira's external pressure. Dende, still serving as Earth's guardian, worked to respond. He installed Popo stones throughout the world with the help of fortune teller Baba, magical stones that would allow warriors to designate safe return points if they lost consciousness in battle, and that would automatically transport the critically injured to safety before they could die. It was a practical intervention. It was not glamorous. It was the kind of thing a guardian did when they cared about the world they were watching over. Not a dramatic gesture, but a quiet, useful one. A figure named Pella also appeared in this period, a descendant of Pilaf, carrying the same ambitions that had defined the Pilaf gang throughout Dragon Ball's history. The desire for world domination, that least successful of motivating forces in the Dragon Ball universe, had apparently proven durable across the generations. Pella set out to fulfill what their ancestor had never managed to accomplish. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Pooh, 10, the final decade, and the arrival of Mira. In age 991, things grew more chaotic. New evil organizations were forming with unsettling frequency. The Pilaf gang's successor, the Pella gang, was active. A group called the Red Pants Army had formed, a clear successor to the Red Ribbon Army that had been one of early Dragon Ball's primary antagonists. The World Martial Arts Tournament, which had continued to be held across all of these centuries, adapted to the new era by adding single and team battle formats to accommodate the growing number of participants. The basic rules, step outside the ring, you lose, had not changed in the 10.5 centuries the tournament had been running. And outside the atmosphere, Mira was preparing his approach. In age 998, he landed on Earth. His base of operations was Bobby Island, named for Bobby Boo, the first child of the Mojin race, in a detail that connected the lightest and most gentle part of the Dragon Ball Online timeline to its darkest current threat. From Bobby Island, Mira coordinated his invasion. He had the remnants of Frieza's army under his command. He had the Red Pants army. He had the various evil organizations that had been forming in the destabilized decade before his arrival. Piccolo began to investigate. Piccolo, who had spent so much of his life as a villain before becoming a mentor, who had been Gohan's teacher and the world's second greatest warrior for a long stretch of Dragon Ball Z, was still here. He was older now in a way that Namekians age, but he was present and he was paying attention. With Dende's assistance, he worked to identify the major threats, understand their connections, and find Earth's worthiest defenders. The problem they encountered was significant. There were no capable warriors on Earth sufficient to oppose Mira's forces. The martial arts schools that had been established over the past 2 centuries had produced many dedicated practitioners, but the gap between what Earth's fighters could do and what Mira commanded was enormous. In age 999, Time Patrol Trunks arrived. He came through a time rift, a crack in the fabric of history caused by Mira and Towa's illegal time travel. He brought warnings about what was coming, and he brought the suggestion of a plan. Dende, convinced, took the Dragon Balls and reactivated them, but with changes. He created multiple sets of Dragon Balls rather than one, allowing more people access to wishes simultaneously. He also weakened them deliberately. Each new set could grant only limited wishes. He did not want a repeat of every historical misuse the Dragon Balls had enabled over the millennia. Then they waited. They hoped. They did what people in the Dragon Ball universe have always done when the situation is larger than what they can manage alone. They looked for a savior to emerge from among ordinary people equipped with extraordinary potential. Port 11. Age 1000. That is where you came in. The game's present day, the starting point for every player who logged into Dragon Ball Online, was a world divided. Earth had been carved into contested territories. Mira's forces controlled portions of it. The Red Pants army operated in their zones. The Pella gang continued their pursuit of domination. And scattered throughout all of it were the ordinary people of age 1000, humans, Namekians, and Majins, who had grown up in this world and were doing their best to live in it. The 3 playable races each came to the game with their own histories and starting points. Human players began in a world shaped by Gohan's book and the 3 martial arts schools. Their character, as a child, would grow into an adult only after completing a significant early milestone, a quest on Korin's Tower that served as a kind of coming-of-age ceremony echoing the earliest days of Dragon Ball. From there, they could choose to follow the path of the martial artist, developing into a swordmaster who specialized in the Kikukenjutsu techniques Goten and Trunks had established, or into a fighter who worked with energy blasts and physical combat. Human players also had an unusual ability available to them. If they collected all 7 Dragon Balls, they could wish for the power to transform into a Super Saiyan. Not because they were Saiyans, they were not, but because the Dragon Balls in the year 1000 could grant that kind of exceptional wish to someone willing to work for it. It was a remarkable piece of world building that honored what Dragon Ball had always been about. The idea that through effort and desire and determination, ordinary people could reach beyond what seemed possible for them. Namekian players began as members of a displaced people finding their new identity in their adopted world. They could choose between the Dragon Clan path and the warrior path. Dragon Clan Namekians followed the tradition of Dende, healers and spiritual practitioners, people who supported others and strengthened the communities around them. Poco priests within the Dragon Clan could summon and fight alongside Pocopen, the creature companions born from Piccolo's old research into his surviving offspring. Warrior-type Namekians followed Piccolo's tradition. They were fighters trained in the combat philosophy of Earth's greatest Namekian warrior. They divided into those who followed Piccolo's original teachings directly, the Makai warriors, and those who had reinterpreted those teachings into something new and distinct, the Madao warriors. Majin players entered the world carrying the complexity of their race's history. The Wanderer Majin walked closer to the corrupting influence that had always been part of the Majin inheritance, aggressive, powerful, capable of real damage in a fight. They could become plasma Majins or karma Majins as they advanced. The mighty Majin was different, softer, more communal, naturally inclined to lift up the people around them and absorb the impact of attacks with the rubbery resilience of Bu's body. Their advanced classes included the Grand Chef Majin, who fought with food-themed weapons and cooking-inspired techniques, and the Ultimate Majin, musicians who rallied allies with songs. Every class, every choice, was rooted in something specific to the history of the world Dragon Ball Online had built across its 216 years of development. Pull Part 12: The Time Machine Quests. One of the things that made Dragon Ball Online distinctive, one of the things that made it worth remembering even now, was the Time Machine Quest system. The premise was simple. Time Patrol Trunks, having taken on the role of guardian of the timeline, needed assistance. Mira and Towa were traveling through time and altering key moments in Dragon Ball history. They were strengthening enemies who should have been defeated. They were shifting the balance of battles that were supposed to go a certain way. They were doing it carefully, deliberately, in ways that served their larger goals. The player's job was to go back and fix it. This meant that Dragon Ball Online players traveled to the Namek Saga, to the Cell games, to the Buu arc. They stepped into versions of these events that had been corrupted, where Zarbon had been made stronger than history recorded, where villains who should have fallen were standing longer than they should. And they intervened. They restored the timeline moment by moment to what it was supposed to be. It was a remarkable conceit for a Dragon Ball game to operate on, and it is difficult to overstate how much it changed what the game felt like. Rather than simply being another player in a world that already contained Dragon Ball's heroes, you were actively defending the story that Dragon Ball had already told. You were working in service of the canon, not just inhabiting it. The Time Machine quests also gave the game a narrative reason to let players encounter the characters they had grown up loving. Gohan and Krillin hiding from Frieza on Namek. Vegeta going after the Dragon Balls. The confrontation with Zarbon, these were not flashbacks or cutscenes. They were missions, situations in which your character's presence and your character's choices affected what happened. Towa appeared in these missions. She was subtle about her goals, withholding her plans even when confronted, treating the Time Patrol as an obstacle she needed to route around rather than a serious threat. Her presence in the corrupted timeline was always specific and purposeful. She was looking for targets to experiment on, to strengthen, to bend toward Mira's ultimate design. Po Part 13: Mira and Towa. The villains Toriyama designed. Akira Toriyama personally designed both Mira and Towa. This is worth dwelling on. The Dragon Ball franchise had many games over the years, and many of those games featured original characters created specifically for the game context. Most of those characters did not persist beyond the game that introduced them. They served their narrative function and remained there in the specific world of that specific product. Mira and Towa were different. Toriyama invested in them in a way that gave them a reality within the broader Dragon Ball continuity. They were not simply game-exclusive content. They were beings with origins in the Demon Realm, a part of the Dragon Ball universe with its own cosmology and its own rules, and their design reflected the care he brought to characters he genuinely wanted to exist in his world. Mira was built from the DNA and physical components of multiple races assembled into a single being of extraordinary power. He was designed to grow stronger by absorbing the fighting techniques and genetic material of powerful warriors. His pursuit of Goku's DNA was therefore not simply a plot device, it was the expression of what he fundamentally was. He was a being made of other beings, always seeking to add to himself, always hungry for the next source of strength. Towa was in many ways his counterpart and his architect. She was a Demon Realm scientist, a figure who operated through planning and manipulation rather than direct power. Her work was the design of the experiments that shaped Mira. Her intelligence was the guiding force behind their shared project. She was cold and patient in a way that made her more unsettling than many of Dragon Ball's more dramatically powerful antagonists. Together they worked through time rather than against it. They did not charge directly at the present and demand its surrender. They reached into the past and adjusted it, carefully in ways they calculated would eventually reshape the present to suit their goals. It was a different kind of villain methodology for Dragon Ball, more methodical, more indirect, more suited to a game world where the player needed to understand why their intervention was necessary at every step. Plot 14. The Development History. Dragon Ball Online began as an announcement in March of 2007. A beta testing period was scheduled in South Korea. The announcement generated the kind of attention you would expect from a new Dragon Ball product: interest, curiosity, excitement from fans who had followed the franchise since the early 90s and were ready to inhabit its world in a new way. Then the delay came. The game did not enter beta when scheduled. Development continued, adjustments were made, and the actual release did not happen until January of 2010, nearly 3 years later than the original announcement had suggested. The studio responsible for the development was NTL, working simultaneously in Japan and South Korea. The game ran on renderware, the same engine that had powered some of the era's major third-party game releases. Yuzo Koshiro, a composer whose work was known throughout the gaming world for its technical precision and emotional range, contributed to the game's soundtrack. Daiki Miki, who worked within the Dragon Ball production structure, noted publicly that he had collaborated directly with Toriyama on the designs for the game. The game was free to play. It used the monetization model that was standard for MMORPGs of the era, a base game you could access without cost, with premium elements available for purchase. It ran on the same general structure as the major online games of its time: character creation, persistent worlds, level progression, quest systems, competitive player versus player content. When it launched in Korea in February of 2010, it had a moment. Fans who had been following its development for 3 years were finally able to play it. The Dragon Ball community found ways to access it even without official English support. Workarounds, community translation efforts, guides written by players who had learned enough Korean to navigate the interface. The publisher in Korea was Netmarble. In Taiwan and Hong Kong, Wasabi distributed the game. At various points, a Chinese release appeared to be approaching, though the details of what happened with that potential version remained unclear. What the game did not have was a global release. It did not come to North America, it did not come to Europe, it did not come to Japan in a form that could be played. The vast majority of the Dragon Ball fan base, the Western audiences who had grown up with the Funimation dub, the viewers who had followed the series through its international broadcast windows, never had a legitimate way to experience it. Part 15. The Closure and What It Left Behind. In September of 2013, the Korean servers went offline. The date was the 26th. 31 days later, on the 31st of October, the Taiwanese and Hong Kong servers followed. Dragon Ball Online was over. The reasons were not entirely straightforward. The game had been available for just under 4 years by the time it closed, long enough to have built a genuine community, long enough for players to have invested real time and emotional energy in its world. But the companies that held the rights, Namco Bandai and Shueisha, had determined that the game was not performing in a way that justified continued operation. There is something particular about the closure of an online world. When a single-player game ends, its world is still there, static, preserved on the disc or the cartridge, available to return to whenever someone feels like it. When an online world closes, it is gone in a way that has no equivalent in other media. The environments that players walk through, the quests that shape their characters, the social spaces where communities formed and conversations happened, all of it disappeared. The Dragon Ball Online servers going dark was not just the end of a game, It was the end of a place. What remained was memory, documentation, and the ideas the game had introduced. Almost immediately, fan communities began trying to preserve what they could. Video footage of quests and gameplay, translations of the timeline and the in-game lore, guides to the classes and their abilities. The Dragon Ball Online Chronicle project that developed on Kanzenshu became one of the primary resources for anyone who wanted to understand what the game had contained. Direct translations of the Korean timeline and guidebook, assembled with care by fans who understood that this history was not going to preserve itself. In 2015, a group of players launched Dragon Ball Online Global, a private server project designed to revive the game and make it accessible outside its original regional restrictions. The project went through years of development, test phases, and gradual repair of the game's broken coding. In March of 2018, Dragon Ball Online Global released its open beta, allowing players from around the world to experience something that had previously been unavailable to them. It was not the original. The coding was imperfect, the translations incomplete, the experience different from what Dragon Ball Online had been in its operational years. But it was there. The world was accessible. The story could be experienced. Tola, Part 16, The Legacy in Xenoverse. The most visible evidence that Dragon Ball Online mattered, that the world it built and the characters Toriyama designed for it had genuine life in them, is the Dragon Ball Xenoverse series. Xenoverse was released in 2015. It became the first major Dragon Ball game to find a global mainstream audience on current generation consoles. It sold well. It found players outside the traditional Dragon Ball fan base. It was, by commercial standards, a significant success, and its entire foundational premise, the Time Patrol, the corruption of the Dragon Ball timeline by time-traveling villains, the player's role as a custom character recruited to fix historical divergences, came directly from Dragon Ball Online. Mira was in Xenoverse, Toa was in Xenoverse, Time Patrol Trunks, in his role as the supervisor of timeline integrity, was in Xenoverse. The core scenario, that Mira and Toa were altering the Dragon Ball timeline for their own purposes, and that the player needed to travel to corrupted versions of key events and restore them, was the same scenario Dragon Ball Online had built its entire Time Machine Quest system around. The difference was context. Xenoverse placed its story 150 years before Dragon Ball Online's age 1000 setting. So the two games' narratives do not contradict each other so much as they exist in different parts of the same larger story. Trunks, dealing with the Time Breakers in Xenoverse, is dealing with a threat that Dragon Ball Online had established as a longer-running problem. Mira and Toa continued to appear beyond Xenoverse. They showed up in Dragon Ball Heroes, the card-based arcade game that became a significant franchise in Japan. They appeared in Dragon Ball Extreme Butoden. They appeared in Dragon Ball Fusions. They were referenced in Dragon Ball Z Kakarot. They were present in the Dragon Ball Supercard game. The characters Toriyama had designed for a Korean MMORPG that closed after 4 years became persistent presences in the Dragon Ball franchise. The world Dragon Ball Online had built became canon infrastructure that other Dragon Ball products continued to build upon. This is an unusual trajectory for a game to follow. Most products that close leave only nostalgia behind. Dragon Ball Online left characters and ideas that the franchise continued to use. Part 17. The world itself remembered. What Dragon Ball Online offered players in the years it was available was something the Dragon Ball franchise had rarely attempted. A world that had gone on without Goku. The franchise's history is, fundamentally, the story of what Goku does. He is the center of gravity. Events happen because of him or around him. The stories that matter most are the ones in which he is present, training, fighting, evolving, encouraging others to reach beyond what they thought possible. He is the protagonist in every meaningful sense, and the world of Dragon Ball is shaped by his presence in it. Dragon Ball Online imagined a world 216 years after he left, a world where his influence had rippled forward through time, through the schools his children and their friends had established, Through the book his son had written, through the martial arts tradition his example had inspired, but where he himself was no longer there, where the people living in Age 1000 had access to techniques that originated with him but had been adapted, refined, democratized, spread across a population that would never meet him. It was a melancholy kind of legacy story, and it was executed with a care that went beyond what most video games attempt. The 216-year gap was filled in, year by year and age by age, with the small accumulation of consequence that follows from great events. Mr. Satan retiring because Boo got bored, Gohan writing a book, Krillin opening a school because his old master was too old to teach, Yajirobe coming down from his tower to grow beans at scale. These are not dramatic details. They are the details of a world that has had time to settle, to process its history, to build something ordinary out of what was once extraordinary. And in that ordinariness, there is something genuinely affecting, the sense of what it means for the greatest age to pass and for the world to continue anyway. The players who wandered through Dragon Ball Online's landscape in its 4 years of operation were not simply playing a game. They were experiencing a particular vision of what the Dragon Ball universe might become in the long aftermath of its heroes. They were walking through Age 1000 and finding it full of history, full of the echo of people they had known from the original series, full of the consequences of events they already understood. Part 18, Forgotten but Not Gone. The title of the game that inspired this documentary is telling, the best forgotten Dragon Ball game. There is something wistful in that phrasing, something that acknowledges loss while refusing to let the loss be the final word. Dragon Ball Online is forgotten in one sense. It cannot be played as it was. The servers are gone. The original experience is not recoverable. Most of the people who play Dragon Ball games today, who picked up Dragon Ball Fighters or Dragon Ball Z, Kakarot or Dragon Ball Sparking, Zero, have no direct experience of what Dragon Ball Online was. But it is not forgotten in the way that truly lost things are forgotten. Its world is documented. Its lore has been translated and archived by communities who understood that it mattered. Its characters exist in games that millions of people have played. Its narrative innovations, the time patrol concept, the corrupted timeline premise, the custom avatar in the Dragon Ball universe, are fundamental parts of the franchise's most commercially successful modern games. And there is something else that Dragon Ball Online left behind, harder to measure than character appearances or gameplay mechanics. It left a proof of concept. It demonstrated that the Dragon Ball universe could sustain a story of genuine scope set in a future that Akira Toriyama had imagined and designed. It showed that there was appetite for a Dragon Ball world that was not simply a replay of the Frieza saga or the Cell games or the Buu arc, that fans would invest in something new, something set in unfamiliar territory, something that asked different questions than the familiar stories asked. That proof, demonstrated in a game that most of the Western fanbase could never play, continues to echo through what Dragon Ball does next. Ta 19. The races of Age 1000 in detail. The world that Dragon Ball Online players inhabited was divided between 3 races, and the designers had thought carefully about what made each of them distinctive, not just as gameplay options but as expressions of history. The Earthlings of Age 1000 were in some ways the most transformed by the passage of time. They had arrived at the game's present day through a process of gradual democratization of power. What Gohan had introduced in groundbreaking science, the idea that Ki was not a special gift but a learnable discipline, had taken root so thoroughly over 2 centuries that the ordinary people of Age 1000 were, by the standards of the original Dragon Ball era, remarkably capable. King Kai had, at some point in the intervening centuries, taught the Kaioken technique to Earth's population, the same technique that Goku had used in his first fight against Vegeta. A method of amplifying power at the cost of physical strain had been distributed to the general public. The Majin people had found ways to adapt and mimic it using the natural properties of their elastic bodies. The effect was cumulative. Each generation had grown up with access to training methods and techniques that the previous generation had only been developing. Each generation had refined those methods a little further. The martial arts community of age 1000 was nothing like the martial arts community of age 784, not because the individuals were more gifted, but because the accumulated work of centuries had made better tools available to everyone. The Namekian community on Earth had undergone its own transformation. They were a people who had twice lost their home planet, first to Frieza's destruction of the original Namek, then to Mira's destruction of New Namek, and they had arrived on Earth carrying both the grief of those losses and the resilience that had kept them going through each one. Their community in the terraformed region of Yahoi Heights was not simply a refugee settlement. It was a deliberate reconstruction of identity, an attempt to maintain the things that made Namekian culture what it was, while building something new in the world where they now lived. The Majin people had evolved the most visibly from their origins. Bobby, the first Majin child born of the Love beam in age 791, was the ancestor of an entire race. Over the centuries, the Majin had developed their own culture, their own traditions, their own relationship with the inheritance of their founder. The community in West City, which had grown out of their decision to protect the city during the attack by Frieza's remnants in age 820, had become something distinctly their own. Pu Lo Part 20, The Music of a Forgotten World. There is an aspect of Dragon Ball Online's production that is easy to overlook when thinking about what the game was and what it meant: the music. Yuzo Koshiro composed for Dragon Ball Online. This was a significant pairing. Koshiro's reputation in the game music community was substantial. His work on the Wise series, on Streets of Rage, on other projects throughout his career had established him as a composer of exceptional craft and range. The electronic precision of his earlier work, the melodic depth that he brought to everything he scored, was part of the texture of Dragon Ball Online's world. Game music does something particular that other kinds of music do not quite replicate. It is designed to accompany extended periods of engagement, to be present without demanding attention, to establish mood without resolving it, to create the atmospheric context in which everything else in the game's world becomes more vivid. The music Koshiro created for Dragon Ball Online was part of the specific feeling of being in Age 1000. It was part of what made the world feel like a world. When the servers closed and the game ended, that music went with it in the practical sense. You could not log in anymore and simply walk through the game's landscapes while the soundtrack played. The experience of the music in context, which is the way game music is meant to be experienced, was no longer available. This is one of the specific losses that comes with the closure of online games. Not just the quests and the story and the characters, but the sensory texture of the world, the sound of it, the way it felt to be inside it. Some of that music has survived in recorded form. Fans who were present during the game's operation captured what they could, but the experience of being in Dragon Ball Online, with the music doing what it was designed to do in the context of the world it was designed for, that is something that only exists now in the memory of the people who were there. Ton, Part 21, What the Timeline Tells Us About Toriyama's Vision. One of the most valuable things Dragon Ball Online preserves is evidence of how Akira Toriyama thought about the future of the world he had created. The timeline that Dragon Ball Online established was not constructed by developers working independently and then submitted to Toriyama for approval. He was involved in shaping it. The specific details, Boo finding a book and creating Miss Boo from it, Gohan writing groundbreaking science, Goku and Vegeta departing Earth in their 70s to settle their rivalry privately, these carry the texture of things that an author imagined, rather than things that a game designer invented and asked permission for. What the timeline reveals about Toriyama's thinking is interesting. He was not particularly interested in escalation for its own sake. The history of Dragon Ball Online's 216-year gap is not a history of ever greater battles and ever more powerful transformations. It is a history of people figuring out what to do with what they had learned, of Goku's influence being translated into schools and books and techniques accessible to ordinary people, of the Dragon Ball world becoming slowly more equitable in its distribution of power. This democratization theme, the idea that ki control was not a special gift but a learnable skill, that the techniques of the Z warriors could be studied and gradually mastered by anyone willing to commit to the work, is one of the most interesting aspects of the world Dragon Ball Online built. It is, in a sense, the logical extension of what the series had always implied about effort and potential, taken to its natural conclusion over a long timeline. The game also demonstrates that Toriyama was thinking carefully about the Majin race's origins. The specificity of the detail about Buu and the book, the same book that had appeared in early Dragon Ball as the means by which Master Roshi taught a young Goku to read, is the kind of continuity that comes from an author who has a complete picture of their universe in their head and enjoys connecting its distant parts. 2. Part 22. The World Martial Arts Tournament Through the Centuries. One of the quiet constants across Dragon Ball Online's 216-year timeline is the Tenkaichi Budokai, the World Martial Arts Tournament. It is there at the beginning of the gap, with Mr. Satan and Buu taking their accustomed places in the rankings. It is there at age 991, when it has grown so popular that new formats have to be added to accommodate more participants. And it is there at age 1000, still running by the same basic rules it has always used. This continuity is telling in a world that has changed so much, where the Namekians have lost their planet twice, where Goku and Vegeta have vanished into supernovas, where new races and new schools and new threats have reshaped everything else. The tournament endures. It is the continuous thread that runs through all of the transformations. The tournament in Age 1000 was significantly more popular than it had been in the Z era. The democratization of martial arts, the effect of Gohan's book and the subsequent schools, had given many more people the capability to participate meaningfully. The number of entrants had grown to the point where single matches had to be supplemented by team battles and separate youth and adult divisions. And yet the essential rule had not changed. Step outside the ring and you lose. This consistency across 1,000 years of Dragon Ball time has something almost philosophical to it. The sense that certain things, once established correctly, do not need to be revised. That the basic proposition of fair competition, of finding out who is better in a controlled context with clear rules, remains valuable regardless of how much everything around it evolves. In Dragon Ball Online's world, the tournament was one of the few places where the different races of Earth, humans, Namekians, and Majins, competed in the same space on equal terms. It was a point of shared cultural identity in a world that had become more complicated and more fractured over the centuries. Tul Saf, Part 23. The private server and the community that built it, the Dragon Ball Online Global Project, which launched its open beta in March of 2018, is one of the more remarkable things to emerge from the game's aftermath. It was built by a group of people who loved the game enough to spend years trying to reconstruct it. They were working with imperfect source material. The original servers were gone, the original code was not publicly available, and what they had to work from was incomplete and in some places deeply broken. The process of building a functional private server for Dragon Ball Online Global required finding ways to patch and repair things that the original developers would have handled through direct access to their own systems. The translation work was its own challenge. Dragon Ball Online had been released in Korean and then in Taiwanese Chinese. The primary fan documentation, the timeline translations, the lore guides, the character information had been assembled by community members who had learned enough of those languages to work with the original text. None of this was professional translation. All of it was fan labor, done out of genuine love for the game and its world. The community that formed around Dragon Ball Online Global was in some ways more committed than the community that had played the original game in its operational years. These were people who had sought the game out specifically, who had heard about Dragon Ball Online, wanted to experience it, and were willing to use a privately operated unofficial server to do so. They were, by definition, deeply interested in what the game had been. The private server could not fully recreate what Dragon Ball Online had been at its peak. There were missing pieces, broken systems, things that had been lost in the gap between the original's closure and the project's attempt at reconstruction, but it gave people access to the world. The maps, the quests, the story, the feeling of walking through Age 1000 in a way that nothing else did. Tom Long. West City and what it became? West City, originally known simply as the city where Capsule Corporation was located, where Bulma grew up, where Trunks lived during the events of the Androids and Cell sagas, had its own particular history in Dragon Ball Online's timeline. In Age 820, during the attack by Frieza's remnants, Buu had stored the entire city inside capsules. This was the same technology that Capsule Corporation had built its entire business model around. The compression of large objects into small portable containers, applied to something much larger than anything it had been intended for. The fact that Buu was capable of this demonstrated something about his own abilities that went beyond simple brute strength. When the attack was over and West City was restored, it had changed. The Majin community, which had gathered to defend it, chose to stay. They built their own section of the city, developed their own culture within it, and established a Majin presence in West City that became one of its defining characteristics. Two groups living in the same urban space, both of them having come through a crisis together, building something shared out of that experience. By the time of Age 1000, West City had been renamed Capsule City, a nod to the corporation that had always been at its center, and to the technological legacy of the Briefs family that had shaped so much of the Dragon Ball world's material culture. It remained one of the significant urban centers of the game's world, a place with layers of history compressed into its geography in the way that cities accumulate their past. The renaming itself is a small but telling detail. Mr. Satan's city had become Pan's network. Korin's tower was still the milestone at which human characters transitioned from youth to adulthood. West City had become Capsule City. The Dragon Ball world of Age 1000 wore its history in the names of its places. Pooh, Part 25. The Easter eggs and hidden details. Part of what made Dragon Ball Online a game worth exploring, for the people who were able to experience it, was the density of the references it contained. The world of Age 1000 was built with the assumption that players had come to it because they cared about Dragon Ball's history, and it rewarded that care with details that required knowledge of the original series to appreciate. The Red Ribbon Army headquarters, which had been one of the major antagonist locations in early Dragon Ball, the base of the organization that had sent its soldiers after Goku when he was a boy, searching for Dragon Balls and finding instead a child who defeated their entire military force, appeared in Dragon Ball Online as a ruined location. Inside the ruins, fans who explored carefully found blueprints for Android 9, an unbuilt android, a machine that had been designed, that had reached the stage of plans, and then had never been constructed. The discovery was the kind of thing that added texture without demanding explanation, a trace of history that rewarded curiosity without resolving itself into anything that needed to be followed up on. This approach to detail, burying specific things in specific places, trusting players to find them and to understand their significance, was one of the things that distinguished Dragon Ball Online's world building from simpler approaches to game environments. The world felt inhabited in a way that purely functional design does not achieve. It felt like it had a past, and that the past was still present in it, layered beneath the surface of the present day. The Popo stones that Dende installed across Earth in Age 990, the magical return points that would transport the critically injured to safety, became in the game a concrete game mechanic that players used to navigate the world, but they also existed in the game as things with a history, as objects that had been placed by a specific person at a specific time for a specific reason. The mechanical function and the narrative context overlapped in ways that made both more meaningful. Pooh, Part 26. The Yardrations and the Questions Left Unanswered. Dragon Ball Online's timeline contains, alongside its many specific and documented details, some gaps, things that are mentioned but not explained, references that raise questions without resolving them. The Yardrations are one of these. Planet Yardrat was destroyed in age 800. The Yardrations, the species who had taught Goku the instant transmission technique during his time recovering from the battle on Namek, a gentle people with an extraordinary command of space and movement, lost their home. Some of them, it appears, made their way to Earth. What the Dragon Ball Online community found, through careful translation and documentation, was that the Yardrations had updated Earth's transportation system with their teleporter technology. They had arrived on Earth carrying the most immediately practical gift they had to offer, their knowledge of movement, of spatial techniques, of the principles that made instant transmission possible, and they had applied it to the infrastructure of their new world. Beyond that, the record grows thin. What happened to the Yardration community in the centuries between their arrival and Age 1000 is not documented in the sources that Dragon Ball Online's archivists were able to translate and preserve. The question of what became of them, of whether they maintained a distinct identity or integrated into Earth's broader society, of whether their techniques spread further into the martial arts traditions of the game's present, these are questions the timeline races without answering. The people who worked to document Dragon Ball Online's lore found this gap frustrating and fascinating in equal measure. It suggested that there was more to the game's world than had been captured in the timeline and guidebook translations they had access to. That somewhere in the game's environments or quest lines or background dialogue, there might be more information about the Yardrations that had simply not been found yet. Or that the gap was genuine and the designers had left some things deliberately open. Both possibilities are worth sitting with. A world that has everything answered is a museum, not a place. A world with genuine mystery in its corners feels like somewhere that extends beyond the map. Part 27. Piccolo, the last guardian. In all of Dragon Ball Online's 216 years of documented history, one figure maintains a continuous presence from the end of the Z era through to the game's present day, in a way that no other Z warrior manages. Piccolo. He was there when the Namekians arrived from New Namekians in age 851, not just as a bystander, but as an active problem solver, working with Great Elder Mori to manage the complications that came with the Namekian arrival. He was there in age 853, dealing with the descendants of the children he had spawned in a darker period of his life. He was there at age 998, actively investigating the evil organizations forming across Earth, working with Dende to assemble defenders. He is, in this sense, the great continuity figure of Dragon Ball Online's backstory, the link between the world the Z Warriors had made and the world the game's players inhabited. Goku and Vegeta were gone, their supernovas tracked in distant sky. Krillin and Tien Shinhan had founded schools that now existed independently of their founders. Gohan had written his book. Mr. Satan had died and been honored. Pan had grown old, but Piccolo was still there, doing the work, still watching over the world, still partnering with Dende, who had served as Earth's guardian since well before the Dragon Ball Z era, to protect the planet neither of them had been born on, but both of them had made the responsibility. There is something quietly moving about this, considered slowly. Piccolo, who began Dragon Ball as the villain of the King Piccolo arc and became something so different in the years that followed, who had been a mentor and a protector and a father figure in ways he had never intended to be, ending up as the longest-serving steward of Earth's safety in the Dragon Ball Online timeline. He could not solve the Mira problem alone. That was what the players were for. But he was there, investigating, preparing, holding things together until help could arrive. Paul 28. The player, the savior, and the nature of the story. Dragon Ball Online asked something of its players that most Dragon Ball games do not ask. It asked them to exist in the story as themselves, not as Goku, not as any established character, but as a new person from a new time, pulled into a crisis that was larger than any individual. Most Dragon Ball games put the player in the role of characters they already know. You play as Goku, you play as Vegeta, you replay battles whose outcomes you have already seen and whose emotional weight you have already experienced. There is pleasure in this, the pleasure of inhabiting a familiar story, of feeling what it would be like to be the person who saved the world. Dragon Ball Online did something more ambitious and more uncertain. It created a custom character and asked, what if you were someone new? What if you arrived in this world that has been shaped by all those familiar stories, and you were a person who came after all of it, carrying the weight of that history but not bound by any of its established outcomes? This is why the player character's origin is designed the way it is. You come from outside the established timeline, pulled through a crack in history by Mirror's interference. You are not from age 1000 exactly. You arrive there with the help of Time Patrol Trunks, and you build your life in that world. Your character grows from a child to an adult over the course of early play. The transition happens at Korin's Tower, the same place where a young Goku had trained in the original Dragon Ball, drinking the same ultra-sacred water that had taken that boy 3 days to reach. The connection to the original series is always there, always present, but you are not repeating it. You are living in its aftermath, carrying its meaning forward, doing the work of protection and preservation that the original heroes had established as the task of everyone who came after them. That is what Dragon Ball Online was, at its most fundamental level, a game about living in the legacy of a story, rather than reliving the story itself. Ta To Long, Part 29, Reflections on Age 1000. Dende was still the guardian, Piccolo was still investigating, Trunks was still patrolling the timeline. The Dragon Balls had been reactivated in smaller, more careful forms, distributed across the world so that many people could reach for them rather than just one. And in this world, fractured, contested, full of the accumulated consequences of 1,000 years of Dragon Ball history, new champions were appearing, ordinary people who had grown up in a world that had learned to take Ki seriously, who had trained in schools built by figures they had only read about in history books, who had never seen a Super Saiyan with their own eyes, but had learned techniques developed in response to that standard. These were the people Dragon Ball Online placed its faith in, not the next legendary warrior, not the child of someone famous, just people, humans, Namekians, Majins, who had decided that the world was worth fighting for and had worked hard enough to become capable of fighting for it. There is something deeply consistent with the Dragon Ball series' underlying values in this choice. From its very beginning, Dragon Ball had been a story about what determination and effort could make possible, about reaching beyond what you thought your limits were, about the work that transformation required. Dragon Ball Online extended that theme across an entire world and an entire century's worth of ordinary people, building towards something extraordinary. The game is gone. The servers are dark. Age 1000 cannot be visited in the way it once could. But the story it told, about what happens after the legends depart, about what the world becomes in their absence, about who steps up when there is no Goku to call, that story is still worth telling. It is still worth remembering quietly in the last hours before sleep. Tom, Part 30. Android 9 and the Red Ribbon Army headquarters, that sprawling facility that a young Goku had dismantled single-handedly, that had stood as one of early Dragon Ball's most striking examples of how one determined boy could outmatch an entire military institution. Players who explored carefully in Dragon Ball Online found something that no one had expected. Blueprints, technical diagrams for an android that had never been built, designated Android 9 in the documentation. The plans suggested a machine that had been designed, had reached the stage of detailed technical specification, and then had been abandoned, left in a laboratory that had been sealed and forgotten for centuries, waiting in the dark for someone to find it? The Red Ribbon Army as an organization was long gone by age 1000. It had been destroyed in the original Dragon Ball series. Its scientists, Dr. Gero, who had built the android series that became such a defining element of the Z era, and the various technicians who had worked under him, were gone too. What remained was the architecture of their ambition, slowly decaying inside facilities that had never been demolished. The Red Pants Army that operated in Dragon Ball Online's present day was a successor organization in cultural terms, a group that had taken up the same posture of militaristic global domination that the Red Ribbon Army had embodied, naming themselves in deliberate echo of their predecessors. But they were not the same organization. The technology and the scientific lineage that had produced the androids, the genetics research and the engineering that had been concentrated in Dr. Gero and his colleagues did not carry forward into the Red Pants Army. It had been lost. Android 9 remained theoretical, a machine that might have existed under different circumstances that had not. The blueprints in the ruins were evidence of a path not taken, a technological possibility that had been stopped before it could be realized, leaving behind only a document in a sealed room that had waited 7 centuries to be discovered. This is the kind of detail that serious Dragon Ball fans found meaningful in Dragon Ball Online. Not because it resolved anything, Android 9 was never built, its plans led nowhere, but because it made the world feel complete. Real places have ruins. Real ruins contain things that were never finished. The abandoned projects and the unrealized plans of the Red Ribbon Army were as real a part of Dragon Ball's history as its completed destructions. Part 31. The Nature of the Demon Realm. Dragon Ball Online introduced something to the franchise's cosmology that had been hinted at in various earlier materials, but had never been given concrete form: the Demon Realm. In the Dragon Ball universe, the cosmological structure had always been layered: Earth, the other world, the Kai planets, the other world's supreme Kai's domain. The Demon Realm existed as a kind of shadow counterpart to these established layers, a region that operated by different rules, that produced beings of different natures, that maintained its own dark hierarchy. Toa was a Demon Realm scientist. This designation told players something specific about what she was: not simply a villain with scientific skills, but a being whose entire intellectual framework came from a place that the established Dragon Ball universe's heroes and guardians had limited knowledge of. She operated outside the normal systems of cosmic accountability. The Supreme Kais, who maintained oversight of mortal worlds and intervened in events of sufficient magnitude, did not have clear authority over what emerged from the Demon Realm. Mira's origins in the Demon Realm meant that he had not come up through the systems that had shaped every other major Dragon Ball antagonist. Frieza had been a product of the universe's mortal hierarchy, a being of extraordinary natural power who had built an empire through the normal mechanisms of force and conquest. Cell had been a product of Earth's own scientific tradition, built from the DNA of the planet's greatest fighters. Majin Buu had ancient origins but had moved through the universe via the established magical systems. BBD's summoning, the power of the sealed container. Mira was built, assembled, constructed in a realm that the established Dragon Ball power structure had not fully accounted for. This was part of what made him a credible threat in a world that had already seen Goku and Vegeta's generation pass. The heroes of the Z era had equipped the world to face challenges within the systems they understood. Mira came from outside those systems. The Demon Realm would continue to be referenced in Dragon Ball media after Dragon Ball Online's closure, appearing in Xenoverse, being acknowledged as a genuine cosmological location with its own inhabitants and its own history. Dragon Ball Online's careful establishment of it as a real place with real beings gave subsequent Dragon Ball storytellers a corner of the universe to continue exploring. Puh 32. What it means to search for Dragon Balls in Age 1000. In Dragon Ball Online, players could search for the Dragon Balls. This was not a passive feature of the narrative. It was an active gameplay element, something players pursued across the open world of Age 1000. The Dragon Balls of this era were different from the ones Goku and Bulma had chased in the original Dragon Ball. Dende, afraid of misuse, had created multiple sets. Each set was weaker than the original, capable of granting limited wishes rather than the open-ended miracles that the original Dragon Balls could produce. The distribution was deliberate. By spreading the sets across the world, he had made it possible for many different people to find complete sets, granting wishes to those who had worked for them, rather than concentrating that power in the hands of whoever happened to have the resources to pursue all 7 balls at once. For human players, the most significant wish available was the ability to transform into a Super Saiyan. This was not lore-breaking in the way it might seem at first. Dragon Ball Online's world had established that the democratization of key techniques over 2 centuries had produced humans of genuinely extraordinary capability. The Super Saiyan transformation, which had once been a near mythical occurrence, something that happened to a handful of Saiyans under conditions of extreme emotional stress, had, in a world where ki control was taught in schools and ordinary people had learned Kaioken, become something a sufficiently dedicated human could wish for and then work to maintain. The Shenron who appeared when the Dragon Balls were gathered in Age 1000 was a different Shenron than the one Namekians had known. The new Dragon Balls had produced a guardian spirit calibrated to their reduced power, still impressive by the standards of the year 1000, but not the universe-altering entity that had once restored the dead in the aftermath of Frieza's rampage on Namek. Players searching for Dragon Balls traversed the game's open world. The regions around West City, now Capsule City, the terraformed Namekian highlands of Yahoi Heights, the ruined zones where Mira's forces had spread, the coastlines and forests and urban districts that made up Earth in the year 1000. The act of searching was the act of learning the world, understanding its geography by moving through it, finding its hidden corners by looking for things that had been scattered across them. 2. Law, Part 33, The Grand Chef Majin and the Culture of a New Race. Among the more unexpected class types that Dragon Ball Online offered its players was the Grand Chef Majin, a mighty Majin who had specialized in a fighting style themed around cooking. The Grand Chef's weapons resembled food. Their techniques had names drawn from culinary tradition. Their combat style was deliberately absurdist, in a way that connected to something deep in the DNA of the Dragon Ball series. Dragon Ball has never been entirely serious. Akira Toriyama's sensibility across his entire career was shaped by a genuine love of comedy, of the absurd placed alongside the dramatic, of characters with ridiculous aspects who were also genuinely capable and genuinely powerful. The series that began with a boy who had never seen a girl meeting a thief, who had spent years searching for magical wish-granting artifacts, and that treated this premise with equal measures of silliness and genuine excitement, was always going to produce a culture with unusual flavors to it. The Grand Chef Majin was, in this tradition, the decision to build an entire character class around the idea of a food-themed fighter was a decision to honor the playful part of Dragon Ball while giving it serious mechanical execution. Grand Chef Majins were not joke characters. They had real combat capabilities. Their style had internal consistency and genuine depth for players who wanted to specialize in it. The absurdity of the premise was presented with the same earnestness as every other element of the game's world. The application of music to combat, it was, in its way, a deeply Majin solution to the problem of fighting, not the overwhelming force of the original Buu. Something subtler, more social, more connected to the community the Majin people had built. Both classes reflected how far the Majin had come from their origins. They were no longer simply the descendants of a chaos being contained in a small pink form. They were a people with culture, with art, with specialized traditions that had developed over 2 centuries of community life on Earth. Their combat styles were their art forms. The Grand Chef and the Ultimate Majin were both expressions of a race that had found ways to be itself. Long Patience of Dend. There is a figure in Dragon Ball Online's 216-year history who receives less attention than he probably deserves. Dende, Earth's guardian since before the Cell Saga, is present at nearly every major decision point in the Dragon Ball Online timeline. He is the one who receives the warning from the other Kai about the Dragon Balls distorting the natural order. He is the one who contemplates sealing them away. He is the one who works with fortune teller Baba to install the Popo stones across Earth in age 990. He is the one who, in age 999, makes the decision to reactivate the Dragon Balls in their new, more limited form. He works with Piccolo to investigate Mira's forces. He works to gather Earth's strongest fighters. Through all of this, through 216 years of watching over a world that keeps changing, Dende is constant. Namekians, Dragon Ball has established, can live for extremely long periods of time. The original Grand Elder Guru had been alive for 500 years at the time of the Namek Saga, though he had grown very old and frail. Dende was young when Krillin first noticed him on Namek, a small, scared child who had shown unexpected kindness to an alien who had arrived on his world in the midst of Frieza's occupation. He had been chosen as Earth's guardian by Goku because of that kindness, because Piccolo had told Goku that what Earth needed in a guardian was not power but genuine care for the world and its people. That care had not diminished over centuries. Dende, watching from the lookout, had seen Goku and Vegeta depart into supernovas. He had seen the Namekians arrive, displaced, and had helped find them a home. He had seen the evil organizations forming in the game's 9th century, the civil war among the Namekians, the growing evidence of Mira's approaching threat. Through all of it, he had kept doing the work, installing stones, gathering information, making careful decisions about the Dragon Balls he was responsible for. The long patience of Dende is not a famous concept in Dragon Ball fandom, but it might be one of the most quietly compelling things Dragon Ball Online's timeline establishes. That goodness, sustained over a very long time, is its own form of power. Part 35. A last walk through age 1000. Close your eyes, if you would like, and consider what it might have been like to log into Dragon Ball Online in the years it was operating. To create a character, to choose your race, your appearance, the way you wanted to inhabit this world, and to step into it for the first time. The world began small, a child's perspective. The early quests were modest, a new student learning the basics, navigating a world that felt large and unfamiliar. The scale of what was happening around you, Mira's invasion, the gathering of defenders, the temporal fractures that needed repair, was not immediately visible. You had to grow into the awareness of it. The landmark of Korin's tower rising in the distance, the Popo stones at intersections, quietly marking the infrastructure of safety that Dende and fortune teller Baba had built. The terraformed highlands where the Namekian community had made themselves a home that looked like the world they had lost, softened at its edges by the particular quality of Earth's light. Capsule City, layered with the history of the Breves family and the Majin community and the centuries of rebuilding after crises. These are the things the game contained, and these are the things that closed with the servers. What remains is the story, told and retold in fan archives and translation projects and community memories. What remains is the evidence in Xenoverse that the world Dragon Ball Online built was real enough to be worth inheriting. What remains is the particular quality of care that Akira Toriyama and his collaborators brought to a 216-year gap in the Dragon Ball timeline, filling it with the quiet accumulation of consequence that follows from great events, the slow settling of extraordinary things into ordinary lives. Dragon Ball Online was the best forgotten Dragon Ball game because what it offered was genuinely worth offering, and what it gave to the franchise outlasted the servers that originally hosted it. The world of Age 1000, the characters Toriyama designed for it, the narrative innovations that Xenoverse inherited, these are the marks it left. And on a quiet night when the screens are dimmed and the world is settling towards sleep, they are worth remembering. The forgotten game was never truly lost. It was waiting, the way good things wait, for someone to slow down and look for them. Rest now. The story is finished. The world of Age 1000 is quiet tonight. Dragon Ball Online left no single dramatic final chapter. There was no in-game event marking the server closure, no farewell quest, no ceremony. The servers simply went dark on their scheduled dates, and the world that had existed inside them ceased to be accessible. This is how most online worlds end, not with a story beat, but with the quiet cessation of the systems that sustain them. But the archive remains. The translations exist. The timeline is documented. And somewhere, on a private server running in a corner of the internet, a version of Age 1000 is still there. Imperfect, incomplete, rebuilt by people who loved it enough to try, waiting for the next person who wants to walk through its world and remember what the best forgotten Dragon Ball game was. 2. Part 36. The Lookout and what it means to watch over a world. There is a structure in the Dragon Ball universe that has been present since the very early days of Dragon Ball Z, long before the game, long before the Buu saga, long before the franchise had any idea what it would eventually become. The Lookout, the floating platform above Earth's atmosphere where the Guardian lives and watches, in Dragon Ball Online's world, the Lookout still stands. Dende still stands there, and from its surface, on a clear night, every light on Earth is visible, every city and settlement and school and training ground, every place where the people of Age 1000 are going about the business of their lives. What Dende sees from there is different from what earlier Guardians saw. Kami, the original Guardian, had watched a world where the knowledge of Ki was restricted to a small number of exceptionally gifted individuals. The mass of Earth's population had no access to that knowledge. The gap between the fighters and everyone else was absolute. Dende watches a world where that gap has been closing for 2 centuries. The Pan Fighting Network, the Kikuken Jutsu schools, the New Turtle School and the New Crane School, all of them have been feeding students into the broader population for generations. Those students became adults who taught their children. Their children grew up with Ki control as a normal part of their understanding of the world, not a mysterious exception to it. The effect of this is difficult to quantify but easy to feel in the texture of the Dragon Ball Online world. It is a world that is more capable than any prior version of Earth in the franchise's history. Not because it has more powerful individuals, the age of Goku and Vegeta is not coming back, but because the knowledge that once resided in a handful of extraordinary people has been distributed across millions. From the Lookout, Dende can sense this. He can sense the spread of Ki-trained individuals across Earth's population in a way that Kami, watching the same planet at the beginning of Dragon Ball, could not have imagined. A world of millions who can channel their energy however modestly. A world that even without Goku has more potential defenders than it has ever had. And still there are threats. Mira's forces, the evil organizations, the slowly building pressure of everything coming toward Age 1000 from outside Earth's atmosphere and through cracks in time. The Lookout gives Dende perspective, but it does not give him peace. It gives him the long view, the view that sees how far the world has come and still understands clearly how much work remains. Pooh, Part 37. Fortune Teller Baba and the Persistence of the Old World. In Age 990, when Dende needed someone to help him install the Popo stones throughout Earth's regions, he did not go to the martial arts schools. He did not go to the Namekian community or the Majin settlement in Capsule City. He went to Fortune Teller Baba. Fortune Teller Baba, older sister of Master Roshi, a small woman who traveled the world in a crystal ball, who operated a fighting tournament in front of her palace and charged impossible fees for fortune-telling services, had been part of the Dragon Ball world since the earliest portion of the original manga. She had appeared in the Buu saga in small ways, and she was still here in the 9th century, still connected enough to the world's deeper currents to be a useful partner for a guardian with a practical problem to solve. This detail is interesting not just as a continuity nod, but as a comment on Dragon Ball Online's understanding of its own universe. The world of Age 1000 is populated by the consequences of every earlier part of Dragon Ball's history. The schools descended from Z warriors, the Majin race descended from Buu, the terraformed highlands descended from the Namekians lost of their home, and the installation of the Popo stones, that quiet act of preparation for a war that has not yet fully arrived, descended from the unlikely partnership of a guardian Namekian and an ancient fortune teller who had outlasted almost everyone she ever knew. Dragon Ball Online's designers understood that a world 216 years in the future would be full of things like this: long continuities, strange survivals, relationships between beings whose extraordinary longevity had kept them present through changes that remade everything around them. Dende is one such being. Fortune teller Baba, apparently, is another. What it must be like to have known Master Roshi's students, to have sat across from Goku before the world understood what he was, and then to still be alive in a world where the schools he indirectly inspired have been running for 150 years? This is the kind of inner life that Dragon Ball Online's world invites you to imagine for its long-lived characters. They are not simply old. They are people for whom the past is not distant. It is something they were present for, that they remember not as history but as experience. The Popo stones that fortune teller Baba and Dende installed together are still there in Age 1000, marking the intersections of Earth's territories. Players who approach them can feel the magical warmth that Baba's work carries. They serve their function, the safe return point, the emergency transport for the critically wounded, and they stand as a small monument to a partnership between two very old beings who had both seen enough of the world to understand that the most useful things you can do are often the quiet, infrastructural ones that nobody celebrates but everybody depends on. Part 38. The Children of Piccolo and the Birth of the Poco Priests. The detail that some of Piccolo's spawned offspring had survived into the 9th century is one of the stranger elements in Dragon Ball Online's timeline, and one of the most interesting because of how it resolves. In the Dragon Ball mythology, Piccolo's method of reproduction was established early in Dragon Ball Z. He could spawn offspring by splitting parts of himself, or through other Namekian reproductive methods. In his earlier villainous incarnation as Piccolo Daimao, he had spawned warriors to serve him. The Piccolo of the Z era had moved entirely away from this aspect of his existence. He was a guardian, a mentor, a single individual rather than a progenitor of forces. The legacy of those older methods of reproduction was something he had put behind him, or so it seemed. What Dragon Ball Online's timeline reveals is that the children spawned in that older era had not all been accounted for. Some had been held in a secret laboratory inside Pilaf's castle, the fortress belonging to the Pilaf gang, those three perpetually unsuccessful world domination enthusiasts who had been present at the very beginning of Dragon Ball and had never managed to achieve anything they intended. The children had been raised there, and after the castle's relevance faded and its occupants moved on to other schemes, they had multiplied and spread into the wild. Piccolo became aware of this in Age 853. He was already dealing with the arrival of the Namekian refugees from New Namek. He was already managing his own role in the community that was forming in the terraformed highlands of Yahoy Heights. And now this, creatures that bore a biological connection to him, that had been developing beyond his knowledge, that were numerous enough to constitute a genuine ecological presence on Earth. He could not address this alone. Great Elder Mori suggested a path, not confrontation, not elimination, but study, partnership, research into the nature of these creatures, who were called Pokopen, so that the relationship with them could be developed rather than a conflict. Piccolo, who had spent much of his adult life learning to connect with others, despite a nature that had initially been oriented toward isolation and dominance, approached this with the patience that his years had developed in him. What emerged from that research was the Poco Priest class, Namekian specialists who could communicate with and command Pokopen, who had built a genuine working relationship with the creatures. understanding their behaviors and their capabilities, guiding them rather than simply controlling them. It was a distinctly Namekian solution, collaborative, rooted in deep knowledge of a subject, oriented toward harmony rather than dominance. The Poco priests became one of the more unusual elements of Dragon Ball Online's class system. Their Pocopan companions were not simple pets or summoned creatures. They were beings with their own history and their own place in the world, now incorporated into the Namekian community's way of operating in it. The class reflected something about the Namekian value system, the willingness to spend time understanding something difficult and to find a way to live alongside it rather than simply eliminating the complication it represented. Piccolo himself, it is implied, remained involved in this work. He was not a Poco priest in the class sense. He was something older and different, but the tradition that produced them was shaped by his initial engagement with the problem. His willingness to research rather than react, to partner rather than simply solve, was the quality that made the Poco priest tradition possible. Part 39, Krillin's philosophy and what it meant for Earth. Krillin never became a Super Saiyan. He never achieved the kind of power that separated Goku and Vegeta from everyone else in their generation. He spent most of Dragon Ball Z fighting at a level that meant every major villain of the era could have ended his life without much difficulty, and this was not a comfortable position to occupy. And yet Krillin is one of the most important figures in Dragon Ball Z's history. His moments of genuine contribution, the Kinzan that cut Nappa, the solar flare techniques, the support he provided in battles where his power was entirely insufficient to match the opponent directly, are the points at which Dragon Ball most clearly made its argument that courage and cleverness matter alongside raw strength. This is the philosophy Krillin brought to the new Turtle School, not the philosophy of matching your enemy's power, the philosophy of finding what you can do that your enemy cannot account for, of understanding your own specific strengths so clearly that you can apply them with precision in situations that should by any reasonable calculation be beyond you. The new Turtle School's curriculum was built around several principles. The first was honest self-assessment. Students were taught to understand clearly where they stood in any given fight, rather than to maintain optimistic illusions about their capabilities. This was uncomfortable knowledge. It meant confronting the gap between what you could do and what the opponent could do without flinching from it. But it was also the only foundation from which useful strategy was possible. The second principle was the art of the indirect approach. Key techniques like the solar flare, the blinding flash that had saved Krillin's life on multiple occasions by removing the enemy's ability to perceive him, were studied and extended. The school developed a repertoire of ways to affect opponents without directly overpowering them. Techniques that disrupted focus, that changed the terrain of a battle, that created openings for allies to exploit. None of these were glamorous. None of them produced the kind of dramatic moments that the great power transformations produced. They were quiet, tactical arts. The third principle was partnership. Krillin's best moments in battle were almost always moments of coordination. Him and Goku together on Namek, him and Goku developing strategies that required both of them to work in concert. The new Turtle School taught fighting as a fundamentally social practice. You were always imagining the battle as a whole, not just your own position within it. You were always looking for where your teammates needed support and positioning yourself to provide it. Over the generations that followed the school's founding in age 821, these principles spread through the human martial arts community in ways that would have surprised their originator. The new Turtle School in age 1000 was not Krillin's school anymore. It had been passed through several generations of teachers, each of whom had added to and refined the curriculum. But the core philosophy was still recognizably his. The philosophy of a person who had spent a lifetime being outpowered and had found in that experience the seeds of something genuinely useful. Pu, 4T, Tien Shinhan, and the Crane's evolution. Tien Shinhan's path away from the Crane School's original teachings was one of the longer arcs in Dragon Ball's history. He had been introduced as an antagonist, a serious, dedicated fighter trained under Master Shen, the Crane Hermit, whose philosophy was the deliberate application of martial arts technique to do maximum damage to opponents. The Crane School's ethos, as Shen embodied it, was cold, proud, and oriented toward victory through superior technique applied without mercy. By the time of Dragon Ball Z, Tien had long since separated himself from this origin. He had rejected Shen's teachings not by abandoning technique, but by reorienting its purpose, turning the discipline toward protection rather than destruction, toward contribution rather than victory at any cost. He trained alone, without students, through much of the Z era. He appeared at critical moments and then returned to his solitary cultivation. The decision to establish the new Crane School in age 821 was, in some sense, the last step in a journey that had been developing since Dragon Ball's original series. Tien had spent decades becoming the kind of martial artist he believed in. The new Crane School was his attempt to pass that understanding to others. His central insight that ki-based techniques could be used to affect opponents of overwhelming strength in ways that purely physical approaches could not, was rooted in specific experiences. The Shin Kiko-Ho, a technique of extraordinary power that he had used against Cell in Dragon Ball Z, required enormous physical cost. He had pushed himself past the limits of what his body could sustain to use it, and the reason he had chosen to do that was that he believed it could make a difference in a fight where his direct power was not remotely sufficient. That willingness to develop a technique powerful enough to matter even against overwhelming opponents and to accept the cost of using it was the core of what the new Crane School taught. Students were not encouraged to seek techniques that were comfortable. They were encouraged to find the one thing they could do that would count, the technique of sufficient force, applied with sufficient precision at the moment when it could change something, and then to develop that technique to the highest level of expression possible, regardless of what the development required. This was a harder philosophy to teach than Krillin's. Krillin's approach was sustainable. It was built around contribution across the whole of a battle, around a long game of support and positioning. Tien's approach asked for the concentrated development of something that would be used once at the right moment at maximum cost. It required students to be comfortable with the idea of sacrifice, not as a romantic abstraction, but as a practical reality of what peak techniques sometimes demanded. In age 1000, the new Crane School students had adapted this philosophy to a world where the potential opponents were merest forces rather than Cell. The contexts had changed, but the underlying question had not. What can you do at the highest expression of your current capability that will matter in a fight against an opponent who outpowers you? The school that Tien Shinhan had established to answer that question for himself was still, 2 centuries later, asking it on behalf of each new generation of students who came through its doors. Port 41, the Koran's Tower Rite and what it meant to grow up in age. 1000, in Dragon Ball Online, human player characters began the game as children. This was deliberate. It was designed to establish that the world of age 1000 was the player's own, not inherited but grown into, not known in advance but discovered through the experience of becoming an adult within it. The transition from child to adult happened through a rite of passage at Koran's Tower. This was the same tower where a young Goku had spent 3 days chasing a small purple cat, trying to steal the ultra-sacred water. The same tower where, in the original Dragon Ball, the lesson had turned out not to be about the water at all. The actual training was the chase, the physical and spiritual development that happened through the sustained effort of trying to catch something just beyond your current reach. In Dragon Ball Online's version of this rite, the player's child character climbed the tower and completed a series of tasks that tested everything they had learned in the early portion of the game. What the tasks were, specifically, was adapted to the year 1000, relevant to the threats and the tools of that era rather than the era in which Koran had first designed the test. But the purpose was the same. The tower was not there to give you something. It was there to require something of you. When the player's character descended the tower as an adult, they were making a choice. From that point, the path divided. The martial arts traditions of H1000 branched at the base of Korin's tower, and the direction you chose would define what kind of fighter you became in the years that followed. The sword master path of the Kiko Kenjutsu tradition, the fighter path of the energy-based combat arts, the support disciplines of the new turtle school influence, each of these was available. Each of them represented a genuine choice about what kind of contribution you intended to make to a world that needed defending. Korin himself, by the age of 1000, was the same Korin who had watched over that tower since before any living human could remember. His lifespan was not measured in years, but in something more patient than that. He had watched generations of fighters make the same climb, the same descent, the same first real decision about who they were going to be. Whether he still saw the echo of Goku in every child who arrived at the base of his tower is not recorded, but perhaps it is not difficult to imagine. Pu 42, the Earth King and the Secret. In age 850, when Muri and the Namekian survivors warned the Earth's ruler about Mira and his army, the Earth King made a decision that Dragon Ball Online's timeline records without judgment, but that carries a weight of its own. He kept it secret. The reasoning was practical, or at least was intended to be practical. Information about an incoming threat of that magnitude delivered to the general population without a corresponding plan of response could cause the kind of panic that itself becomes dangerous. That disrupts the ordinary functioning of society. That causes people to make bad decisions from fear rather than good ones from preparation. The Earth King had advisors, presumably. He had military and governmental structures to consult. And in consultation with those structures, he concluded that the information should be managed. This is a recognizable kind of decision. Governments make it, institutions make it. The calculation between transparency and stability is one that anyone in a position of authority over a large population eventually has to make, and it does not always resolve clearly in favor of either option. The Earth King of age 851 was not a villain for making this choice. He was a person in a difficult position, making a reasonable assessment of what his people could absorb. But the consequence of the decision was that the Earth's preparation for Mira's eventual arrival happened without the full knowledge of the population being protected. The Namekian community in Yahoi Heights, already training for self-defense, knew. Piccolo knew. Dende knew. The martial arts schools, aware of the broader threat environment, trained harder without necessarily understanding the specific source of what was coming. And the population at large went about the business of age 851, not knowing that their king had just been told that the destroyer of New Namek was aware that Earth existed. By the time the secret could no longer be kept, by the time Mira's forces arrived openly in age 998, nearly 150 years had passed. The Earth King who had kept the secret was long gone. The secret had passed through institutions, had been inherited by successors, had presumably been revisited by each of them and found to still be a secret worth keeping, until at last it ceased to be a secret because the thing it was warning about had actually arrived. This is a quiet tragedy in Dragon Ball Online's history, not dramatic. Not the kind of thing that generates battles or transformations, just the slow weight of a secret kept too long in service of a protection that may have done less good than the truth would have. Pulo Part 43, The Majin Civil War and Its Aftermath. The events surrounding the Egg of Evil in age 940 and the civil war that followed Namara's emergence in age 972 are among the most difficult passages in Dragon Ball Online's timeline, not because of the scale of violence they involved, but because of what they meant for two communities that had already lost so much. The Majin who came to Earth after New Namek's destruction brought something with them that they may not have fully understood they were carrying. The Namekians understood their own darkness in terms of the Egg of Evil, a thing born from accumulated negative feeling, sealed away, eventually impossible to keep sealed. The Majin were the inheritors of something similar through their biology. The nature of Majin Buu The ancient, powerful, chaotic entity who had been the source of everything the Majin race became was not simply gone from them, it was quieted, redirected, present in attenuated form in every Majin who had ever lived. The egg of evil's appearance suggested that the quieting had its limits. That 2 centuries of Majin life on Earth, with all the ordinary pain and difficulty that life involves, had gradually deposited something that the Majin's bodies and spirits could not entirely process. The accumulated weight of that unprocessed darkness had found a form. When Namara emerged from the sealed egg in age 972, the civil war that followed was not simply a conflict between a villain and the people opposing him. It was the Namekian community confronting a darkness that had come from within itself, from the Majin who had migrated to Earth after New Namek's destruction, through whom the evil had accumulated in the first place. This was not something that could be resolved by fighting alone. It required the kind of reckoning that communities do not do quickly or easily. The aftermath of the Civil War in age 1972 is not documented in as much detail as the events leading up to it. The Dragon Ball Online timeline notes it and moves forward, but the evidence of its effect is visible in the state of the Namekian and Majin communities in age 1000. Both of them are present and active. Both of them are willing to fight alongside the other factions of Earth in the face of Mira's invasion. Whatever the Civil War produced, it did not fracture the alliance between the communities to the point of permanent separation. Perhaps the reckoning happened. Perhaps the Namekian community found ways to address the source of the darkness rather than simply defeating its current expression. Perhaps Namara's emergence and the war that followed were part of a painful process of working through something that could not be indefinitely sealed. The Dragon Ball Online world, at age 1000, seems to be on the other side of that process, still marked by it, still shaped by it, but moving forward. Ta Law. Part 44, The Red Pants Army and the Persistence of Bad Ideas. There is something darkly comic about the Red Pants Army. Not in the way that Dragon Ball has often been comic, with the light touch and genuine warmth that Toriyama brought to even his villains, but in the more uncomfortable way that history sometimes is comic. The way that bad ideas refuse to die, the way that organizations built around the desire for conquest and domination keep re-emerging, with different names and different aesthetics, and the same fundamental emptiness at their core. The Red Ribbon Army had been one of early Dragon Ball's primary antagonists. It was a military organization with extraordinary resources, dedicated to gathering the Dragon Balls and to using them and everything else at the organization's disposal to achieve global domination. Its leader, Commander Red, had funded the entire operation not because he wanted to rule the world, but because he was a short man who wanted to wish himself taller. The reveal of this motivation, that all of that infrastructure, all of those soldiers, all of that violence had been in service of one man's vanity, was one of early Dragon Ball's great comedic and critical moments. The Red Ribbon Army was destroyed by a child. Goku, still in the early days of his development, dismantled it. Its scientists continued, most famously Dr. Gero, whose work eventually produced the Android series that defined the beginning of Dragon Ball Z, but the organization itself was finished. The Red Pants Army of age 991 was its descendant in attitude rather than direct lineage. The name was the acknowledgement, deliberate or ironic, the designers did not specify, of the legacy it was choosing to operate within. The red color scheme, the military structure, the posture of organized force in service of domination, all of it echoing the organization that a boy with a power level that should have been manageable had destroyed 900 years earlier. By age 1000, the Red Pants Army was under Mira's effective control, another faction among the several he had brought into his broader campaign against Earth. It had not achieved anything that the original Red Ribbon Army had not failed to achieve. Its soldiers were no more successful against the individuals they encountered than their predecessors had been. The persistence of this type of organization across 9 centuries of Dragon Ball history suggests something about the Dragon Ball universe's understanding of evil. not as something that originates in extraordinary darkness, but as something that is produced regularly and predictably by ordinary human failures of imagination, by the desire for power over others, by the willingness to organize violence in service of goals that do not justify it. The great supernatural threats, Frieza, Cell, Buu, Mira, are exotic and powerful and cosmologically significant. The Red Ribbon Army and its successors are something more mundane and, in their way, more consistently present. Tool Law Part 45. Bobby Island and the Strange Geography of Memory. Mira chose Bobby Island as his base of operations on Earth. This was presumably a practical choice. An island provides natural defensibility, limits the angles of approach, creates clear perimeters. The logic of military positioning that applies in any world applies on the Earth of Age 1000. But Bobby Island's name carries its own significance. It was named for Bobby Buu, the first child of the Majin race, born in age 791 to Miss Buu and the original Majin Buu, named in honor of the moment when the Majin people began. The island had been given this name at some point in the long centuries between Bobby's birth and Mira's arrival, as a gesture of the Majin community's affection for their founding family. The collision of these two facts, that the place where Mira established his Earth invasion was named for the first Majin child, is the kind of detail that Dragon Ball Online's designers included without drawing attention to it. The irony is there for anyone who knows the history. The place named for the gentlest moment in the Majin origin story became the base of operations for the most dangerous external threat Earth had faced in 2 centuries. It is not a coincidence in any narratively intentional sense. Mira chose the island for strategic reasons, not for the meaning of its name. But meanings accumulate in places over time, and the Earth of Age 1000 is full of locations whose names carry layers of history. Capsule City, named for the technology that defined its founding family. Yahoy Heights, where the Namekians terraformed their new homeland. Bobby Island, where the invasion gathered. Each name is a small history. Each one tells you something about who cared about that place and what they thought was worth remembering. And in the aggregate, they create the particular texture of a world that has been lived in for a very long time, a world where even the landscape has been affected by the events that happened in it. Ta 46. The question of canon and why it matters for forgotten games. Dragon Ball Online's relationship with Dragon Ball canon is complicated, and it is worth sitting with that complication for a moment before this documentary draws fully to its close. The game was made under Toriyama's supervision. The characters he designed, Mira, Towa, were embraced by the franchise and continued appearing in subsequent Dragon Ball media. The timeline it established for the 216 years between the end of Dragon Ball Z and Age 1000 has not been directly contradicted by any official source. By most reasonable definitions, it qualifies as canon. And yet, the game is closed. It was never released in most of the world. The vast majority of Dragon Ball fans have never experienced it directly. The official English-language Dragon Ball canon, the version of the story that most Western fans engage with, through the anime, the Funimation releases, the games that received global distribution, does not include Dragon Ball Online in any form that is directly accessible. This creates an unusual category of canon that is technically authoritative but practically inaccessible to most of the audience it is canon for. The Daisenshu guidebooks, which are the other major source of Dragon Ball canon that never received official English release, exist in a similar condition. Their contents translated by fan communities and absorbed into the general understanding of the series among dedicated fans, but not officially part of the English-language Dragon Ball experience. The question of why canon matters in this context is worth asking. It matters because the stories that are recognized as part of the ongoing Dragon Ball universe shape what the franchise can do next. If Dragon Ball Online's timeline is canon, then the franchise is committed to a future in which Earth's population has been democratized in terms of key access, in which Mira and Towa are real historical figures. in which the Majin race exists as a result of Boo reading a book in Mr. Satan's study? These facts constrain and enable future storytelling in specific ways. The Dragon Ball Super series, which ran while Dragon Ball Online's servers were already closed, navigated its relationship with Dragon Ball Online's timeline carefully. It did not directly contradict the major facts of the game's setting. It did not explore Age 1000, but it also did not establish anything that would make Age 1000 impossible. The two timelines are parallel rather than contradictory. This is, perhaps, the most honest answer to the canon question. Dragon Ball Online was canon when it was made, under conditions of genuine authorial involvement. Its status as canon did not change when the servers closed. Its facts were not unmade by their inaccessibility. They are simply facts that most people do not know, sitting in the Dragon Ball universe waiting to be relevant again in whatever form the franchise eventually takes. Pooh, Part 47. The Three Friends and What They Left Behind. In the end, what Dragon Ball Online's history keeps returning to, in its documentation of the 216 years between the Z era and Age 1000, is three friendships, three relationships that shaped what the world became after the great battles ended. The first is between Goku and Vegeta. These two men spent the entirety of Dragon Ball Z in a relationship that was never quite a friendship and never quite a rivalry. Something more complicated than either word captures. Vegeta arrived as a villain, softened into an uneasy ally, hardened again under Babidis' influence, and finally arrived at something that looked more like genuine partnership by the end of the Buu saga. The fact that they left Earth together in their 70s to spend the remainder of their lives fighting each other in a private corner of the universe, the fact that they chose each other for that final chapter says something about what their relationship had become. Not easy, not without tension, but something that was worth choosing repeatedly over all the alternatives. The supernovas that Earth's astronomers tracked after their departure were the physical record of that choice. The universe noticed what those two men did when they were finally free of the need to protect anything except each other. The second friendship is between Gohan and his book. This is not a friendship between people, but the relationship between Gohan and the act of writing about what he had experienced is one of the most moving things in Dragon Ball Online's timeline. After his father's departure, after the Great Era had ended, Gohan sat down and tried to make the extraordinary ordinary, to understand Ki not as a superpower, but as a discipline anyone could practice, to translate the experience of a lifetime of impossible fights into something that could be useful to someone who would never be as strong as he was. The book that he wrote changed the world he lived in, slowly and without his being present, to see how far the change reached. That is one kind of immortality, not the legendary kind, not the kind written in supernovas, but the kind that lives in changed understanding. The third friendship is the oldest and in some ways the strangest. Krillin and Goku, from before Dragon Ball Z even began, from the days of training under Master Roshi on a small island, competing and cooperating and constantly measuring themselves against each other, Krillin built his school in the place where Goku had first been active. That choice, geographical, deliberate, not made by accident, was the clearest statement Krillin ever made about what that friendship had meant to him. He could have built the new turtle school anywhere. He built it where Goku had started, as if to say that everything that came after was continuous with that beginning. Age 1000 carries the traces of all three of these relationships in its landscape and its institutions. The schools, the traditions, the democratized Ki knowledge, all of it is descended from friendships and partnerships and rivalries that ended in the personal sense with Goku and Vegeta departing into the stars. But the consequences of those relationships were not personal. They were distributed. They spread through 2 centuries of human and Namekian and Majin life until they were simply part of how the world worked. That is what Dragon Ball Online understood in its best moments. That the great figures leave, but the world they made continues. That the students of the students of the students of Krillin are still alive in Age 1000. still practicing what a short, bald, cheerful man figured out about fighting from an inferior position? That the children of Boo's curiosity, his discovery of love in a book, his creation of Miss Boo, their founding of an entire people, are still living, still pink and elastic and full of their particular culture, still contributing their particular gifts to a world that accepted them. Dragon Ball Online left no single dramatic final chapter. There was no in-game event marking the server closure, no farewell quest, no ceremony. The servers simply went dark on their scheduled dates, and the world that had existed inside them ceased to be accessible. This is how most online worlds end, not with a story beat, but with a quiet cessation of the systems that sustained them. But the archive remains. The translations exist, the timeline is documented. And somewhere, on a private server running in a corner of the internet, a version of Age 1000 is still there, imperfect, incomplete, rebuilt by people who loved it enough to try, waiting for the next person who wants to walk through its world and remember what the best forgotten Dragon Ball game was. Thanks for drifting through these Dragon Ball stories with me tonight. If you're ready for more, there's another calm video waiting just to the left. Let it guide you deeper into rest. You might fall asleep to something new,